Hi and welcome to today's video about the New South Wales Renewables Plan and how we can reach zero net emissions. I'll start with Australia's emissions trend, then talk about where we are now and where we need to be in terms of emissions. Then I'll talk about an exciting new development with New South Wales establishing itself as a renewable superpower. But it's not only governments that have to act to achieve net zero emissions, it's every one of us. So I'll also talk about where our emissions are coming from and what we can do to reduce them to net zero. I'm known for helping organizations drive net profit with zero emissions. I'm Barbara, the co-CEO of 100% Renewables, and I believe that it's possible to reach net zero emissions in a cost neutral, if not cost positive way. Now this graph here shows you Australia's historical emissions. At the moment, we are emitting roughly 530 million tonnes of carbon emissions, and that's annually. To put this into perspective, it means that every one of us is responsible for about 21 tonnes of annual emissions. This is roughly 4 times higher than the global average of about 5 tonnes. What's interesting to see in this graph is that our emissions in 2020 are about on the same level as they were in 2000. Is this good enough? Let's have a look at global emissions. Despite the increased focus on climate change in the last few years and the milestone Paris Agreement, global greenhouse gas emissions have not reduced. And the emissions gap between where we should be and where we are is larger than ever. The main driver of long-term warming is the total cumulative emissions of greenhouse gases over time. In the past decades, greenhouse gas emissions have been increasing, and due to all historical and current carbon emissions, global temperatures have already risen by about 1 degree Celsius from pre-industrial levels. Continuing with business as usual, which you can see here in the blue line, could result in a temperature increase of over 4 degrees. If all countries achieve the Paris Agreement targets, it could limit warming to 3 degrees. However, to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, current Paris pledges made by countries are not enough. Carbon emissions need to decline at a much steeper rate in the near future and reach net zero by mid-century to have a chance of keeping warming to below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Australia has committed to a 26 to 28% greenhouse gas reduction by 2030 from 2005 levels, but that is not ambitious enough for a 1.5 degree pathway. Also, as a country, we have not yet committed to net zero emissions, which is where we need to be. However, all states and territories have committed to this target, which effectively means that Australia has a net zero target. With most of Australia's major trading partners having now committed to a net zero emissions target by around mid-century, and with a new US president-elect who seems likely to increase America's climate ambitions, perhaps the Australian government will eventually follow suit. We've heard in recent days that the government may abandon plans to use Kyoto carryover credits to meet its targets, which is a good start if it's true. We will see what happens with our national emissions targets in time. Let's have a look at Australia's emissions projections. Now, under 2019 projections, that's the green line here, we will end up with 500 million tonnes of carbon emissions in 2030, some 30 million lower than our current levels. And our nationally determined contribution to the Paris Agreement, we need to reach a 26 to 28% reduction by 2030. This is not anywhere near where we need to be to keep temperature increase to safe levels. However, the good news is that even without policies and targets, the renewables share of electricity will grow because we've reached that point where renewables are cheaper than fossil fuels. Now, for many years, we haven't done enough. Now, we need to catch up on the years in which we have procrastinated, and rapidly. Enter New South Wales. In March this year, the New South Wales government released the Net Zero Plan Stage 1 and the Electricity Strategy. New South Wales officially committed to a 35% reduction in emissions by 2030 and to reaching net zero emissions by 2050. The focus of the plan is on emissions reduction across key sectors such as energy, transport, waste, agriculture, mining and carbon finance. The net zero plan and the electricity strategy will create thousands of new jobs and billions of dollars in new generation and transmission investment in New South Wales, mostly in regional areas. A few days ago, the New South Wales Electricity Infrastructure Roadmap was released, which will establish New South Wales as a renewables superpower through a coordinated approach to transmission, generation and storage of renewable energy in the coming decades. Over the next 15 years, 4 of the 5 New South Wales coal power stations are expected to close. Now, these 4 power stations, which you can see here, account for 3/4 of New South Wales electricity supply. You can see in this graph here how the closed power plants will leave a gap in electricity generation. The exciting news is that this gap will be filled by renewable energy generation. New South Wales will develop several renewable energy zones enabled by a transmission development scheme, which will have a combination of solar, wind and pumped hydro generation. And the infrastructure needed to replace power stations has long lead times. And the Central West Orana is the first pilot renewable energy zone that's currently being developed. Central West Orana, New England and the Southwest renewable energy zones will contribute 12 gigawatts of generating capacity and 3 gigawatts of firm capacity by 2030, and even more over the long term. These renewable energy zones will contribute greatly to grid decarbonization, which means that over time, the electricity we consume will increasingly come from renewables rather than fossil fuels. However, this transition will take time. And we can't rely on governments doing all the work. Everyone needs to act, countries, companies, and communities. So what can you do in your organization and as an individual to track towards zero emissions? To answer this question, we first need to take a look at where our emissions are coming from. The biggest part of our emissions is our electricity generation, which you can see here in the dark blue bar, which at the moment comes mostly from fossil fuel power plants. The next biggest part is stationary energy consumption, such as burning natural gas. The next highest contribution is from transport, which is us driving cars, moving goods in trucks, and flying, for example. Fugitive emissions are mostly methane emissions lost to the atmosphere during coal and gas mining, and also by transporting gas. Industrial processes and product use emissions come from industrial activities that don't relate to energy, such as cement and lime, metal and chemicals. Then there's also product use from hydrofluorocarbons, such as which are refrigerant gases in your air conditioning and refrigeration equipment. Agriculture emissions, they come from fertilizer usage and growing animals such as sheep and cows. Now, Bill Gates has said that if cattle were a country, they would sit behind China and the US in greenhouse gas emissions. Waste emissions mainly come from the decomposition of waste in landfill, whereas LULUCF emissions are land use and land use change and forestry. In Australia, these emissions are negative as they are a carbon sink. The emissions reduction task is a combination of a small number of significant measures that are happening to reduce the emissions of major inputs to goods and services, and the actions that individual businesses and consumers can take to reduce the carbon footprint. Now, as indicated on this slide here, there is some heavy lifting that happens independent of us consumers. The biggest example would be grid decarbonization, which I talked about earlier. Coal-fired power plants are being replaced with renewable energy in all Australian states. Just this week, Victoria announced $540 million in the budget to develop 6 renewable energy zones, and Tasmania wants to be 200% renewable by 2040. There is also a big push for green hydrogen in nearly every state, which could potentially replace natural gas over time. Now, the New South Wales Net Zero Plan is aiming for hydrogen to supply up to 10% of current natural gas demand by 2030. Biomethane is gas being produced from renewable sources rather than extracting natural gas. Reforestation means planting more trees, which reduces carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. Green steel is made by using hydrogen rather than coal to strip the oxygen out of iron ore. The byproduct is water rather than carbon dioxide. At this time, ThyssenKrupp plans to build a 1.2 million ton per annum green steel plant in Germany by 2025. Cows produce quite a bit of methane, which I've said before, which can potentially be reduced by up to 80% by introducing seaweed into their feed, based on research led by CSIRO. One of the ways we can deal with the waste problem is to treat the waste as a resource in waste-to-energy plants. And the last point here, sequestration of emissions resulting from the extraction and production of LNG is a major challenge, but one which will hopefully improve in coming years. Now, most businesses and consumers will benefit from these upstream and downstream changes in terms of their carbon footprint. But rather than rely solely on these changes, some which may take decades, business and individuals can act themselves to reduce their carbon footprint faster. So, what emission sources can you influence? Well, every day you are consuming electricity, and most of you probably use natural gas as well, whether for industrial processes such as process heating, or using it in air conditioning, or even cooking at home. Also, everyone needs to get from point A to point B. Sometimes we use cars, sometimes we fly, and we transport our goods using trucks, ships and trains. Everyone consumes goods and services on a daily basis, and our consumer choices influence emissions. And sadly, we all produce waste. So how can we reduce our emissions to net zero? Well, we can be more energy efficient, for instance, by turning off equipment when it's not needed, or by replacing old inefficient equipment with new energy efficient ones. Where we can, we should install solar. It reduces our emissions immediately, and it's cost effective. And in future, battery storage will be more cost effective as well, which will allow us to scale up our solar ambition and take more control over our energy supply and also our energy risk. We can choose where the electricity we're buying comes from. We can consciously choose to buy renewable energy. Big organizations can do that via power purchase agreements, and smaller consumers can elect to purchase green power. We can buy efficient, low and zero emissions vehicles and implement EV infrastructure, such as charging points. Even bigger trucks can be electrified, which you can see in these pictures here. Using video conferencing also helps to reduce emissions. We can reduce our emissions from waste simply by consuming less, or by recycling more, and by fostering a circular economy in which the waste of one organization can be a resource for another business. And we can make more sustainable buying decisions and purchase carbon neutral products, or products that were made from renewable sources, or products that can be recycled or composted. On our journey to net zero, we can also invest in carbon offsets to finance projects that invest in emissions reduction or sequestration elsewhere. And perhaps most importantly, we can show leadership. We can implement all the solutions I've talked about earlier and then share our stories with others so that they can learn from our experience. Don't be a follower, be a leader, or at least a fast follower. I challenge you to rethink your carbon footprint today, both yours and the one of your organization. So here's your personal challenge. You can switch to 100% renewables. You can walk and cycle more, which is also going to be good for your health. And you can consider switching to a more sustainable diet. Now, I hope you've enjoyed today's video. Please subscribe for more content like this. I hope to see you in my next video. Thank you.